Hello, my name is Gregory Swigoski, and I'm an independent fire consultant here in the San Francisco Bay Area. The California Sustainable Wine Growing Alliance has asked me to speak to you today about fire preparedness as part of their risk management project. They'd like to thank the USDA Risk Management Agency for their support and invite you to check out the related guide, A Winegrower's Guide to Navigating Risks, online. Preparing for a fire at your winery and vineyard. How would you fight a fire without a hydrant or water line? It's a very interesting question. The majority of farms that we go to are far from municipal services with either water nor sewage servicing them. So typically we have a well, we have septic tanks and things of this nature. There might be a pond on the premises, but typically there is not a water main going directly towards these agricultural sites. When fighting a fire on these sites, we use a combination of three things: water tanks, ponds, and water shuttling operations. And throughout this presentation, we'll be covering these things, going into detail about water tanks, going into detail about water shuttling operations, and talking to you about the right and wrong way of drafting water from a pond. The first question that you need to ask yourself is, who is the first responder in your area? If you assume it's going to be a state agency, then you've assumed and you've already made a mistake. You need to find out who is your first responder. Get that name, get that number, and then find out from where they would be responding from. You need to know how long it would take them to get to you. Find out the physical locations of the vehicles, go ahead and get it on a map out the location, and then drive from point A to point B and record the time yourself. Knowing how long it takes to get your first responder to your property lets you know how long you'll be on your own to fight that fire. How much water will that first responder bring? It's a very important question. Typically, an engine truck carries between 500 and 1,000 gallons of water, and tanker trucks that are ancillary vehicles in that firefighting operation carry the majority of the water. You need to know how much water they will bring, so you might be able to supplement that water from water that you have on the property. And why not ask your first responder to come to your property and give you a risk assessment? In any business, it's always good to know people on a first name basis. And I would much rather be Archery Winery than a number on a road. What about water? Do you know all the water access locations on your property? Is this a secret just for your vineyard management guys? It's also important for your workers and staff to know where all those water locations are as well. Are those locations marked? In the past, we've seen flags used, maybe an inch thick fiberglass pole, maybe about 15 feet high with an orange triangle on it, blue triangle also to denote water. That works very, very well. Knowing where the water is very important. Do you have those locations in map form? If you can map every location where you have water on your property, laminate that map and have that map available for any first responders coming to your property, that is a tremendous asset for them, because you have to remember, these people do not know your property, and anything that you can help them lets them help you. Basic logistics. Is there actually really a 100-foot defensible zone around your structures? Go ahead and take a look. 9 times out of 10, we see shrubbery, we see hedgerows, we see a variety of different things. Those structures, those buildings on your property are where you do business and where you make your money, and they must be defended. You have to have a defensible zone around those buildings to make sure that fire cannot race directly right up to them. Do you have all your ag chemicals, fertilizers, pesticides in one place? And how far is that location from your diesel and gasoline storage? The combination of diesel fuel and fertilizer is extremely explosive. The flip side of that coin, you do not want to make pesticides and fertilizers and various chemicals airborne and create a breathing hazard for people on the property and your first responders. Do you have a water supply? nearby where you're storing said chemicals. That way you can make sure that you can douse that building, or that building can be doused and everything can be soaked prior to the fire approaching. And one of the things that we see all the time are large piles of old pallets, fence posts, felled trees on your property. That has to be removed and taken away. If you have a large supply of pallets that you use for shipping, perhaps you might want to think about a sprinkler system that is on the ground and run with hoses that you could douse those pallets with in case of a fire. But it's a tremendous amount of wood, and very dry wood 9 times out of 10, that can lend itself to burning easily. Protecting your staff. Should your staff fight a fire or flee from it? That's the most important question that you're going to want to ask yourself. You have to understand what your insurance liabilities are, what you want the staff to do, so on and so forth. And that's a determination that is strictly up to you, your business, and your property. Does everyone in your organization know all the routes off of your property? 9 times out of 10, the vineyard management people and the people working in the vineyards know all types of little roads and routes, and sometimes they're only accessible by ATVs. It's important that those are known and those are mapped out. It's a basic safety step for all of your employees. What type of audible alert system do you have that can be heard across your property? Some type of siren, some type of a klaxon. These are very inexpensive things. Many times they are small units that can be hauled behind an ATV. They can be set into place. They're waterproof. It is a wonderful investment, and it lets people know from miles away that there is some emergency happening. And have you developed a fire emergency plan? And how often do you and your staff drill that emergency plan? Practice makes perfect. In any workplace that you go to, there's usually an evacuation route there on the wall. It should be the same for any type of a farm worker, people working in the fields, and so on and so forth. One question that we always want to address is, do you have a majority of your workers who are Spanish speaking? What about your seasonal workers? Is there a language barrier? If there is, you must do your best to make the same training available in Spanish as you do in English. Water tanks, what to know. How many water tanks are on your property? That's the first thing that you need to know. The second would be, how many gallons of water are actually available? If you have a 25,000 gallon tank, 35,000 gallon tank, 100,000 gallon tank, how much water is available in that tank? And secondly, how long does it take to recharge your tank in the driest months? Do you have a finite amount of water, 100,000 gallons, and then it's gone, and then it takes 2 weeks to refill that tank in the driest period? Because let's face it, most fires do happen in the driest period. You have to go ahead and do those calculations. Are your tanks NFPA 22 approved? Do you know what NFPA 22 is? Your fire engineer, construction engineer, or fire professional will know what NFPA 22 is. NFPA is the National Fire Protection Agency, and 22 is the code dictating the use of tanks. Make sure that any tank you purchase is in fact NFPA 22 approved, and ask for documentation showing that that tank is actually approved. Don't take somebody's word for it. Is there a free working area of 50 feet around your tank? When a deployment comes about, fire engines, water tanker trucks, so on and so forth, these are very large pieces of machinery. So if you can put this picture in your mind, can a semi truck drive all the way around my water tank and sort of make a 3-point turn to get in and out of there? That's the most important thing, because what if the action is happening at the back of the tank and there's a chain link fence and a hedgerow 10 feet away from the back of the tank? That's not going to do any good for anybody. Make sure that it's easily accessible to vehicles. Do you regularly verify the amount of water in your tanks? How is that done? Do you send somebody out once a week to check your tanks in a pickup truck? Go ahead, use the liquid level gauge on the side, write down those numbers. Do you do it electronically? There's a variety of different ways to do this, and certainly we can help you with that. Do you test your valves to make sure that they are not frozen? If there's a valve there at the front of your tank to be used for fire, and there hasn't been a fire for 4 years, 8 years, 10 years, 9 times out of 10 that valve is locked solid. That valve always needs to be greased and oiled and ready to go in an emergency situation. It is your responsibility to understand what type of fittings your local responder needs to hook their hose up to. Can a first responder hook up their hoses to your water tank fittings? We can't stress the importance of this. According to Battalion Chief Scott McLean, this is what works best for CAL FIRE. For overall uniformity and estimatable flow rates, CAL FIRE prefers a 2.5-inch male fitting national hose thread. Additionally, any system needs to be supported by a plumbing system of sufficient scope and size. If there is a pump in that system, it must be clear how that pump is turned on. In the end, we prefer a laminated sheet of instructions attached visibly to your systems, because chances are you will not be there to explain it to us when we need to use it. So taking all that into consideration, do you know what type of fittings are on your tanks? It's strongly suggested that you find out what your local responder needs, what fittings you have, and make sure those two things are copacetic. Strategically placed water tanks. One very inexpensive way to disperse water around a property is the use of 5,000 to 10,000 gallon water tanks. They can be purchased at a modicum. They are easily available at most garden centers. What you do is you want to place these on the compass points around the property. You also want to use them in a manner that allows you to protect life and property that are far away from the main water tank, or they're in places that are difficult to reach. By strategically placing water tanks near high-value facilities and structures, there is an immediate, albeit small, supply of water to use. These tanks are typically filled by a water truck or ideally recharged by a nearby well. Firefighting skids for trucks and ATVs. Have you ever considered using a firefighting skid that could be forklift onto the back of a pickup or ATV? These again are readily available by reputable dealers. The prices can range from $12,000 to as low as $3,000 per unit. Typically what you have is somewhere between 200 and 400 gallons of water. You can go ahead and use a foam additive which can triple your coverage, but it's highly suggested that you choose a green foam in case that water or foam is being sprayed anywhere near the area where you grow grapes. Water shuttling. Water shuttling is an interesting operation. It's integral to fighting rural fire, and most people have never seen it because they have not come into contact with a rural fire. It composes 3 different elements: the main fire engine, folding and or collapsible tanks, and a tanker truck. Part 1. The fire engine arrives on the scene. The main engine only carries between 500 to 1,000 gallons of water in reserve. Some of the firefighters begin to fight the fire, whilst others begin to unfold a series of collapsible tanks. Part 2. Once those tanks are deployed, they can hold between 1,000 and 5,000 gallons of water, but that capacity is based on being set on level ground. So if they are deployed on an incline, capacity is lost. Part 3. The tanker truck comes, and tanker trucks typically have a maximum load of 3,500 to 4,000 gallons of water, and they begin to empty that water into the deployed folding tanks. Once those tanker trucks are empty, they drive off to refill and return with more water. So as you see here, the firefighters run or submerge drafting hoses into the deployed folding tanks and begin to draft water from the tanks to the main engine pump. Then that water is pumped out onto the fire whilst the tanker truck is running to refill and return with more water for the folding tanks so that the main engine can continue to draft out of the tanks. We'd like to take a moment and talk about water shuttling operation using water from ponds. A float dock strainer is a device that sits on top of the water. It has a very fine mesh, and water is pulled through that mesh into the main engine. Float dock strainers allow water to be taken from a pond or river or any body of water without sucking debris, garbage, or plant matter into the main engine pump. Taking water from bodies of water without a float dock strainer can destroy the pump on the main engine and halt firefighting altogether. You'd have to imagine a large wad of cattails being pulled up through the hose and hitting that main engine pump. All firefighting stops, and another engine would have to arrive for that firefighting to begin again. And here are some examples of how float dock strainers are deployed and how they're used, and the rate and flow of water is tremendous that you can use from a float dock strainer if you have the right equipment. What about propane? This is a question that we get a lot. Propane tanks should not be emptied or vented prior to evacuating your property. They are equipped with a safety valve in case of fire. Propane is heavier than air, and it will hug the ground, not rise up and disperse. Any spark, engine ignition, cell phone, cigarette, floating ember will cause an explosion. You should cut off all propane leaving the tank and going into surrounding buildings so propane does not feed the fire in those buildings. It's the most important thing about propane. Thank you very much, and should you have any questions about this presentation, please address them to the email address below.